Good evening and welcome to the Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Once again, I have the opportunity of introducing to you a man who, following our Lord Jesus Christ, was open to the beauty of the fullness of the church. Brian Besong is here, former Baptist and Southern Baptist and Presbyterian. And Brian, it's welcome. It's good to have you on the Journey Home program.
It's nice to be here.
Pulling you a little bit away from your PhD studies in philosophy.
Well, that's okay.
Well, I'm anxious to actually later in the program ask you how your study of philosophy had an input on your journey, and as well as the need for that. And we can talk about that as we get later in the program. But first of all, I usually ask my guests to take a long step back and give the audience a little snippet of your early spiritual journey.
Sure. Well, I was, as you mentioned, I was raised Southern Baptist, but my earliest memories were disciples of Christ. My dad had been from Pennsylvania, and he was brought up in a Catholic family, large Catholic family, and he got a scholarship to Houston Baptist University in gymnastics. Well, he was Catholic. Well, that's fine. He'll go and, get a free education. But he met my mom, and soon after, he left the Catholic Church and went to a Protestant church, the Disciples of Christ, that at that particular church was liturgically similar enough to the Catholic faith that he was used to for him to feel comfortable with the switch. And so my earliest memories were Disciples of Christ, and one of the things I was raised in my youngest years there, one of the earliest memories I have was the frustration of I wanted to be baptized, and they wouldn't let me. I wasn't old enough yet. And so I was explained everything. Well, I needed to have faith in Jesus, and I have that. And I needed to be at least, they weren't definite, but at least like 13 or 14 before they can take it seriously, the profession of faith. So
I know the disciples have a strong view of the Eucharist, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't remember what their view of the baptism was, or why they were. Was it more like a Southern Baptist view of baptism?
Honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
It wasn't too long after that my parents decided to switch from that church to a Baptist megachurch, and so that's where my earlier formation really occurred. And so this was a church that a little bit later on they formed a satellite, and they helicoptered the pastor from the one church to the other. Yeah, they had their own bowling alley and things like that. So a lot of perks of switching. But at any rate, so they had it was a very large church. There's 3 levels, and mega church. And each Sunday there would be an altar call. And so by the time I forget exactly what age I was, but maybe 10-ish, I responded to an altar call, and so I sort of spontaneously got up out of the pew, and I went to one of the people in the front, and I prayed the sinner's prayer, and then soon after that, they ushered me and the family to a sort of back stage, you might say, area where they counseled me on what that meant, and then they asked my parents to become members, because I don't think they were at that point yet, and so that sort of spurred them into maybe a little bit deeper into that church. And so...
in your dad's movement from his childhood Catholicism into Disciples of Christ and then Baptist Church, did he have a serious turn away from the Catholic faith, or was it more of just, his movement?
I don't know. He's not... I know that intellectually he was inclined to continue to think Catholicism was true, as... After my conversion, it didn't take much, I think, for him to see what I was telling him was true about the Catholic faith. And so he quickly moved back intellectually into the Catholic faith in his youth.
Okay.
But I think...
He pretty much just put it on the back burner?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it...
So he didn't influence you in a negative way against the Catholic Church?
No, not at all. In fact, I remember him mentioning as I grew up that he would have debates with these Houston Baptist University students about the Catholic faith and how they were very anti-Catholic, and how he would try to say, well, it's not so bad, let's take a step back. So I remember him telling me that as a young man, and so it was definitely not a negative influence about Catholicism.
So you came forward and accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior in the typical Baptist fashion.
Right, and I was baptized in a second floor baptistry in the full view of the 3 floors of the mega church.
Wow.
And so that was my baptism. But I grew up in Houston, and Houstonians get used to driving hours for anything. And I think it was about a 45-minute to an hour drive to get to church on Sunday. Well, I think that eventually took its toll with my parents, and so we switched from the mega church to a smaller local Baptist church. And that's where I spent most of my early teens. But I was active. I cared about my faith as a young man, and so I was not yet old enough to be part of the youth groups at that church. So I started going to youth groups at other churches, and so I was part of a local, I believe it was a non-denominational youth group, and then soon after I joined up with the youth group at an evangelical Presbyterian church. And as I sort of progressed,
When you say evangelical, is that with a capital E? Or
yeah, the EPC.
It was EPC, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I was sort of concurrently members of the youth groups at a certain point, the Baptist and the EPC, and I think I would attend both of them sort of concurrently, depending on my mood, I guess. So,
well, you were one of those then that experienced the power of the influence of youth ministry to draw you into the faith as well as into the active part of the church then.
Yeah, I would say so. I would definitely say so. And as a part of that, at the EPC church, I participated in 2 sort of mission trips to Mexico, and so that was I think it was fun. I don't know how much it influenced my faith. My motives were not like I need to serve the poor or anything like that. It's like all my friends are going, and so I'm sure there's always mixed motives with these things. But
well, actually intended. I mean, it's like taking kids on ski trips. Well, most of them are going to go because they want to ski, but you're hoping that the opportunity will be a way for the Holy Spirit to touch their hearts.
Sure.
So you know that.
Yeah.
If you only limited it to those kids that are actually committed to the mission, you might get 1 or 2. There you are.
Sure. Yeah. You can't build homes like that. So it was during one of these youth group mission trips that I was first introduced to Calvinism, and it was a debate with my youth pastor. I believed that there was free will, and he said, "No, read Romans 9." And so soon after, pull out the Bible, read Romans 9, sort of in shock. Well, that seems to suggest this is not my choice, so that debate was soon after ended, and I became a sort of intellectual convert to Calvinism from that point forward. And the pastor of that church often would tell people about me as, if you want to see a good convert to Calvinism, look at Brian Besong. And so I was firmly convinced. And
well, maybe looking back, a lot of the audience won't know what your position would have been at that point. I mean, how firmly did you believe that an individual human being does not have freedom of the will to choose for God?
Well, I was fairly firmly convinced. During this time period, I read other books as a sort of progression of that line of thought. So I read books by like A.W. Pink, and I loved the systematic theology of Wayne Grudem. I got this as a young high schooler, and I sort of read through this, and so the more I read, the more sort of firmly convinced I became. And at that point, Calvinism was for me a notion of salvation, choice and bondage of the will and that sort of thing. As I progressed, Calvinism became a little bit more deep to me, though I was always young, so I don't know how much I knew really about that. But so firmly convinced was I of Calvinism that as a high school graduation gift, family friends gave me the complete works of John Calvin on CD and things like that. So, so after I was sort of intellectually confirmed in this Calvinist theology, I picked up books by Wayne Grudem and A.W. Pink, and I started running Bible studies for my high school friends, and so we would go through like the the tulip,
Right.
and so I would sort of try to convince them.
Or to tell our audience tulip.
Yeah, so
I'm trying to remember what all total
depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints.
Right.
So the basic notion is it's a sort of capstone of Calvinist theology. But so I would try to persuade my friends, and it was not easy. I remember at one point a girl crying from learning about this Calvinist notion of salvation. But I was very intellectually inclined to that, and so I loved the works of Cornelius Van Til, who was a well-known among Calvinists apologist who sort of thought that he could apply Calvinism's notion of the fall of reason to apologetics. So the corruption of reason, you wouldn't give common ground to the atheists in trying to convince them of things using their corrupted reason. Rather, you'd show them that they're already presupposing God in a number of ways. And so, at any rate, I was very...
So you have that whole movement of the Dutch Calvinists.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And of course, Francis Schaeffer would have been in
right.
And the reason we mention these names, and many of you out there listening have heard of some of these names, and they fit into this category of strong Calvinism, but then trying to therefore address philosophical ideas and trying to make it explain the philosophies of our world based on the presumption that man has lost his free will to do anything good to get him right with God.
Right. And I suppose I should take a step back and maybe explain a little bit of what made me so intellectually inclined. In addition to being convinced of the sort of truth of these ideologies, I remember I was, as I mentioned, going to this Baptist youth group, and it was not that much different than the youth group at the EPC, but one thing that stood out was that the sort of youth pastor was an excellent preacher, and the band was excellent, and everything was excellent. Fog machine, lights. It was a show, and the youth group over time became bigger and bigger and bigger. And I remember we held a sort of like event at the local, like a local pavilion, and there was like big crowds, 50 to 100 at a time for the altar calls and things like this. So at a certain point, I remember the youth group got to, I believe, 300 or 400 young people at each Wednesday night session, and I would see the strong sentiments being evoked by singing the praise and worship music and hearing these stirring messages of the love of Jesus, and I could see the effects of those things. For instance, some of my friends would go to multiple altar calls, and pray the sinner's prayers, repeatedly, and that sort of left an impression on my mind. But the stronger impression that was left was when the youth pastor decided that he actually had a vocation to regular pastorship and not being associated with youth anymore, but with adults. And so he, and it seemed rather abrupt at the time, he left the youth group. And I remember a group of 300 or 400 people diminished to approximately 50 people within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. And the impression that was left on my mind was, look, this is sentimentalism. The relationships that are being formed here between a person and Jesus are largely a matter of the good feelings that are being evoked by these sorts of things. So at that point, I was very strongly moved against what I perceived to be a sort of sentimentalism in the faith. So even though I would have said at the time and still on that I would have a personal relationship with Jesus as a sort of, this is the terms used by most evangelicals especially, is this personal relationship, and I would certainly have affirmed that. But I also thought of the faith as being more intellectually rigorous and having more content than a mere, you believe Jesus is the Son of God, you believe in the Trinity, and you sing praise and worship music. And so... So I started to move more and more into the intellectual side of the faith and thinking through these issues.
Were you also at the time seeing that there was kind of a contradiction between tulip that strong Calvinist view and the very means at which you were reaching people with altar calls and such. You know, there's, I don't know if it's historically true or not, but it seemed that there was, for example, that the Calvinists were the the last to get involved in the missionary movements.
Yeah.
Because they believed so strongly in the sovereignty of God.
Right. He would arrange things.
Then if those in the deepest parts of the world are going to be saved, God can do it, because whether they're saved or not is totally up to God.
Right.
Not up to me going and trying to convince them. But yet your whole church experience at that point was about trying to convince them.
Right. Well, at the time I would have, and in fact I remember, now that you mention it, a debate that I had with one of the assistant pastors of the church, that he was opposed to Calvinism for that very reason, is it tends to make people sort of still and not try to be active in proselytizing. And so I disagreed with him, because I thought, well, look, we're obviously obligated to do these things, and the other stuff is sort of background, right? If someone's coming up and doing an altar call, it's because of that irresistible grace. And if they fall away afterwards, it's because they were never one of the saints that is supposed to persevere. And so I don't think that at the time I would have seen any contradiction, but I was very intellectually convinced. And so...
See, I remember there's always an out clause.
Yeah, right.
You know,
there's an explanation.
If they fell away... well, they confess with their lips what they didn't believe in their heart.
That's right. That's right.
So there's always an out clause with that. But the question is, what is the relationship between the actual living out of the faith and the way you practice it and what you believe?
That's right.
And I'm sure that's a part of the journey later. But
yeah,
I remember that being in the same boat. Actually having altar calls from my Presbyterian church. Yet I was a staunch Calvinist.
Yeah.
It really doesn't make sense.
Right. And I think I remember reading like Charles Spurgeon or something like that saying something against altar calls too, because it just smacks too much of a non-Calvinist attitude towards salvation. But at the time I sort of thought that these were perfectly fitting means to get people to feel that irresistible grace and to move to God. As you can probably imagine, when it came to choosing a college, I wanted Calvinism, and so at first, actually, I being a young man, I didn't know too much, and so I thought that Moody Bible Institute sounded good, so my dad and I went to Chicago, and we took a tour of the university, and I was in the bookshop. I like to look at books, and so I'm looking at books, and I strike up a conversation with someone who's also there, and I asked him a little bit about the school, and I said, are they Calvinists here? And he's like, well, I suppose some are. They're all dispensationalists, though. And I actually didn't know that much about dispensationalism prior to that, but when I got home, I started looking up a lot about dispensationalism, and I was convinced that was not the school for me. And so when it actually came time to choose a school, I chose Calvin College, and there was a few Calvinist schools, but that was the one that I sort of thought of as the one for me, and it was actually the only college I applied to, because I was so into that.
Known as a staunch Calvinist school, a Calvinist area, very, very almost a seedbed.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a sort of all of Western Michigan sort of gets influenced by that sort of CRC movement up there. And so I started in college, and my inclination was to do missionary work. So I started off with the inclination to do a theology and philosophy major, and took my first theology class, and the chair of the department was the one who was teaching it, and there was very little Calvinism that was believed by, as far as I could tell, most of the people in the department, and I would see posters of Hans Kung and what I later come to find out are the sort of usual suspects of Protestant liberal theology. And so I was thoroughly disillusioned by the theology department there. And the school itself put on a fairly good show of Dutch Calvinism, and so we were made to read some of like the works of Kuyper and some of these other people that were influential in the Dutch Calvinist strain, but as far as if you actually wanted to study theology, there was very as far as I could perceive, there was little in the form of Calvinism to be found there. And so I thought, at the time also, I discovered the philosophy department's excellent. They've got a heritage of excellent philosophers that have come through here. So, well, theology and philosophy, I'll just drop the theology. And so I studied philosophy, and I actually came to find out that I like philosophy quite a bit. And
Peter Kreeft used to be at that school, right?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, it's funny because after I've graduated from Calvin, there's a number of former Calvin grads who have converted to Catholicism. So, in fact, I've heard that it's very good at getting people away from the tradition that it's founded in. But they were very firm in their Calvinist commitments. In fact, I remember there was a not so subtle emphasis by the president to get people out who were not committed to the tradition of Calvinism. And so it's not as though they were, I think at least at some level they really wanted to be firmly committed to that tradition. But in school I began to take seriously the Calvinist notion that I had been convinced of, which was that justification was extrinsically imputed, that I was not justified because of anything, what you might say, intrinsic to me. I was sort of covered over with the mantle of Jesus, and so there was nothing, when God looked at me, he didn't see my own merits or demerits, but rather the merits of Jesus. And so
a person in this life isn't changed.
That's right.
If you are of the chosen by God, you are given the gift of that covering of the righteousness of Christ.
Right.
You had nothing to do with it whatsoever. Right. Even to your dying day, as Luther claimed, he could commit adultery 10,000 times in a day and not lose it. Yeah. Because it was just this covering of, you point to Jesus, you point to Jesus.
That's right.
It has nothing to do with me.
Right. Sin boldly and believe all the more boldly, I think. So I sinned boldly. And you know, at the time, previously in high school, I had not been, what I came to know now is this is in both before and after. I was not living a life of sanctity according to the traditions of the church. But in high school, I remember I was sort of, I went through two phases, one in high school and one in college. The first phase was what you might call like a scrupulosity of ambiguity. So there's not very firm teachings about what's right and what's wrong, but you sort of get these, well, dancing seems wrong, right? Alcohol seems wrong. Caffeine, maybe, or smoking, or these sorts of things. But, you know, there's no mention of these in the Bible that are, you know, strong prohibitions. And so I thought to myself, well, if these things are apparently wrong, then I'll stop doing them. And so I sort of went through this period of, I got rid of all my non-Christian music, right? And this is, I remember being at a youth retreat, and I remember one of the guys there was saying about how someone in his high school had said, I want to be like you. And I remember that guy, he was very much like that. You know, I didn't perceive him doing a lot of these sort of ambiguously bad things. And so I tried to imitate that, got rid of all my unchristian music and just listened to Christian music, and I wouldn't smoke or anything. It's not as though I did that before, but I had a more firm commitment. Yeah. And so in college, I began to take more seriously that fact that, look, my merits or my actions, insofar as that goes, don't get me any closer to God, because I'm as close as I can possibly be, because God looks at me and he just sees Jesus. Yeah. And so incrementally I began to sin with increasing boldness. And, you know, I had friends there that were older, and I would hang out with them and I'd drink underage. And, but then they were older, so occasionally they'd go to bars. I couldn't go with them to a bar, and so then I'd go with my dorm buddies and we'd go to parties, and the partying got more and more progressed. And so the sort of low point was I was arrested for drunk driving as a sophomore, and that really shook me up. During the time, you know, even though I had an intellectual bent prior to going to college, I had not really taken my studies seriously. And I think sometimes it's a handicap if you're a little smarter in high school, because most of the time you can get by without doing a lot of work. And so you form these habits of being very lazy and only reading what's interesting and only doing the work that's interesting. And so when I got to college, if you don't read what's not interesting to you, you're not going to do so well. So especially during this first couple years, I was not a strong student. And after that point, I began to take things a lot more seriously. And it was not too long after that, I was going through, there's a lot of things that you have to do, court dates and things like this, which really shook me up. And so it was not long after that I met my wife. Now, she lived in the area and stuff like that. So meeting her and getting to know her provided me a lot more stability to get through that period of my life. And so when the time came to graduate, I really didn't have a firm decision about what I wanted to do, but I thought, look, I'm good at philosophy. I like philosophy a lot. I'll apply to grad schools. And I started at Purdue in 2005 and studying a PhD student in philosophy. And we were married in the Catholic Church. My wife was a cradle Catholic.
Why don't we pause there, because it's about time for a break.
Sure.
I wanted to get back to what you were saying, though, is would you say that your movement into being more open, even more bold into some sinful aspects of your life really had the philosophical, theological backing to it, do you think? Or at least it was there?
Well, when you're sinning, you don't want to think too much about God. And so, but after your sin is over, right, the passions are sort of subsided, you can rationalize the behavior, right? So no resolutions to change will be taken seriously. Why? I mean, why do I need to change? I look exactly the same from God's perspective, before and after. So there is a strong tendency to rationalize and not to resolve to change those things, at least not resolve in a very serious way that would actually affect your behavior.
Yeah. And I think the issues of don't dance, don't play cards, that are in some of those environments are not scriptural, but it's almost a bit of a group think, right? The people that you respect don't like those things,
right?
So they must not be good,
right?
And boy, if they see me doing them, they're going to think I'm not a good Christian, so maybe I better not do them either.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, there's the morality that can come around with a lot of those issues.
Right.
Let's take a break there, Brian.
Sure.
We'll come back in a little bit and we'll pick up, because you've met your wife. And that's going to have a big change in your life at this point. Okay, let's talk about that when we come back in a moment. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and our guest tonight is Brian Besong. We've interrupted your journey. You've just met your wife.
That's right.
Was she an active Catholic?
No, she was not. She was a cradle Catholic, but the knowledge that she had of the faith was not very strong. Her dad, he didn't want me to say this, but he called himself a C&Eer, and what that is Christmas and Easter only. And so the faith that she was formed in was not very strong, but she knew that she wanted to get married in the Catholic Church, so I didn't see any problem with that. It didn't really matter to me. And so we got married in the Catholic Church, and got married that summer, and then I started.
Were you required to make the usual commitments to children?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Of course, being the sort of dissolute person that I was, I was changing, but I probably didn't take it that seriously.
Kind of fallen back from a commitment to your faith at that time?
Not at the time, no. In fact, one of the things that I think one of the misperceptions of me at that time was no faith, right? No personal relationship with Jesus. But I thought about God.
Yeah.
I thought about God after I sinned, right? And I didn't use that thinking about God to change my actual behavior. But again, I had no reason to. I knew the faith, right? The faith.
Yeah.
And so I knew that
Did you worry about whether you were one of the elect or not?
I did sometimes, and one of the reasons why is internally my conscience strongly reproved my actions, and so I was filled with guilt, right? But aren't I supposed to be filled with guilt, right? Isn't the law supposed to lead me to Jesus, to the grace imputation of Jesus? And so yes, I did think about God, and I did continue to have what I would describe then and now as a personal relationship, insofar as anyone has a personal relationship in those conditions.
Yeah.
So we got married in the Catholic Church, and I started at Purdue soon afterwards. And during that time, at the beginning of our marriage, I think I attended Mass with my wife once or twice, and then she attended the Reformed Presbyterian. And so as I sort of progressed through college, I became more and more Calvinist, and so I never joined as a member, but when I attended church, I attended an Associate Reformed Presbyterian, and then as I started at Purdue, I found my intellectual affinities with the Reformed Presbyterians to be the strongest. But I rarely went to church, and so we went, go here a little and go there a little, and then we just didn't go anywhere.
So it really wasn't a part of even your marriage at that point?
That's right. I say now to people that I don't have any memories of praying as a couple. We might have said a blessing for our meal, maybe. I don't remember that. My wife seems to remember that, so it might just be that it slipped my mind. But no, it certainly wasn't part of our relationship. And so for that period of time, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, our faith was basically a sort of stagnant thing. For me, it was an intellectual exercise. You ask me questions about my faith, I will affirm even with vigor the truths, but it wasn't as though it affected any of our actions or my actions. And so it sort of wore on me and us, though. I thought in the back of my mind, I want our kids to be raised in church, and so it bothered me that we didn't go anywhere. I wanted to sort of settle these matters before we had kids, and find something to go to. So I think my wife, I would always, when I'd say this, I'd say that, but I certainly am not going to be a Catholic, because there's all sorts of problems with that. And so one of the things that she wanted to do was find out more about her faith, so she could maybe at least know what it is that she believes, and potentially even answer some of my objections. And so we bought the book Catholicism for Dummies, and it was a great book.
Father Trujillo, right?
Yeah, what's that?
I think it's Father Trujillo.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
And so I like to read, and she doesn't like to read, so I read the book first. And I'm reading through this book, and I see this section on mortal versus venial sin. That's new. Mortal sin, you can go to hell for doing these things, like going to confession. Wow, that's serious. Missing Mass on Sundays without a serious reason. Hey, we do that. Using contraception. We do that too. And so, one of the first things out of my mouth was, hey, do you know anything about mortal sin, Amy? And she's like, that vaguely sounds familiar. I think they might have mentioned something like that in church or catechism class long ago, but I don't know anything about it. And so I read the description, big eyes. Oh. And so I decided to start going to Mass with Amy just as I didn't want her to get any sort of spiritual trouble. We weren't going anywhere. And actually, it was sort of an interesting convergence, because during that time she was sort of experiencing some female health problems, like pains and irregularity and things like this. And so in the book, it was either in the book or I looked online, there was some mention of something called natural family planning. And so I was like, well, maybe some of these things are going on because of birth control. And so let's look into this natural family planning stuff too, more as a health thing than as a, because I was convinced that it was wrong to do or something like that. So that's sort of where we were, and I started to go to Mass with her, and we started to look into natural family planning. And there was a sort of, during this time, I was sort of intellectually interested. I didn't know that much about the Catholic faith. I never took it seriously, and I often say that the best comparison for my concept of the Catholic Church was like lederhosen. And what I mean by that is I thought of it as a sort of ancient relic of Europe. It's not a faith. It's this sort of bygone exercise of European culture. And it was not a faith because most of the Catholics that I knew had no strong faith life. And the only Catholics that I knew, or the only religious people that I knew, for instance, in my dad's family, or at least that I knew of, were the people who had left the Catholic faith and became Protestants. And they seemed very strong Christians. And at least as far as I knew at that time, those that were Catholic were not very strong. And so I didn't think of it as a serious faith. And but in reading Catholicism for Dummies, it seemed like, well, there's a lot more to it than I originally estimated. I'm kind of curious. And so I think one of the things that really influenced me during that time was going to Mass with Amy. There was a sort of gravity to the Mass that was very, it pulled me, even though at the time I would have not really admitted that, but there's a sort of seriousness to it, even though it wasn't, it didn't seem like a pretense. And the reason I say that is because at Calvin, I remember attending these high liturgically styled Protestant churches with my older philosophy friends, and I always thought that they were a joke. I mean, it seemed to me like a big show, and a silly one at that. And but going to Mass, it seemed very different, and I felt sort of pulled in a way that I wouldn't have been able to describe then, and also not now. Which made me take more seriously the objections that I had to the Catholic faith, because there's this pull, this draw, but at the same time, I mean, their notions of Mary are crazy, right? That's what I thought, at least. And so I had this book that was, the book's title was Early Christian Doctrines by J.N.D. Kelly, and it's frequently used. It's actually a textbook, I think, at a lot of Protestant seminaries. But I'd had this book and I never actually read it, and so I said to Amy, maybe some of these objections, maybe I'll have some more insight into why the Catholic Church thinks what it does if I read about some of this early church stuff. And so I decided to do that, and it wasn't long. It's one of the first few chapters in it that talks about Scripture and tradition. And it wasn't long before I get completely disabused of the notion that the early church believed in sola scriptura, or the notion that doctrines derived from the Bible alone. So I saw in the conflicts with the Gnostics and other early heretics that they didn't so much appeal to the Bible as they did to the bishops and to the authority of the bishops and the apostolic successors.
Yeah, actually, as Newman discovered for himself, that was the heretics.
Yeah, they would most
that were the Bible-only folk. They were going to the Scripture, to a Scripture, or to a collection of Scriptures alone. It was the church that was appealing to the magisterium, the bishops.
That's right. So I was pretty shocked. I mean, and the reason I say that, well, as a Protestant, no one ever explicitly told this to me, but you sort of get this notion of the early church as being Protestant, right? And over time, these changes incrementally added up until the kernel of the Protestant faith was sort of hidden over by this sort of Roman tradition. And so I'm reading about the early church. I find nothing about that. And I find a lot about the early church. Not just, late 500, 600 AD, but early church. And the earliest I could find was the Catholic faith. And that shocked me. So I like philosophy, and one of the things that I think makes me like philosophy is I like the attitude philosophers have towards truth. I think more so in other disciplines, if a philosopher is convinced of something, he will defend it and he'll pursue it, and come what may, no one can agree with him, but he'll continue to look into it and pursue it. And so that's essentially what I did. I converted to Catholicism very quickly after that. And so, I began RCIA, and I began to work through and read a lot more in addition to the early Christian doctrines that I had started with, and histories of the church and things like that. But one of the things that happened right before that is I thought, oh my goodness, okay, this is very convincing, right? The early church is a Catholic church, but there's got to be something wrong with it, right? They wouldn't have all left if it was all right. And so I pull out my John Calvin on CD, and I pull up the Institutes, and I am just looking furiously for the objections that he had. The powerful arguments that he must have had. I mean, he was an intellectual genius, I thought. Certainly he had good arguments for rejecting the Catholic faith, and I couldn't find one. And so I also go on these apologetics websites, and the two that I remember, there was one, carm.org, and then there was another one, Alpha and Omega Ministries. And that one, and the second one was more anti-Catholic than the first one. But I started looking at their objections to the Catholic faith and say, okay, well, there's got to be something to what they have to say. And so I'm looking through these, and I'm on the fence, and I can't find a single argument that's persuasive to me. Every single one, I mean, this voice in my head would suggest the response, and I'd find the response more persuasive than the argument that they presented. So I was like, I don't have any reason not to be a Catholic, and these arguments here are very persuasive about the early church. And so then I sort of look at the Bible again with new eyes, and all these Catholic verses are jumping out at me. How did I miss that? The church, the pillar and foundation of the faith? Not the Bible? So that's the basic, that's how I was convinced.
You had spoken a lot about the Calvinist views, tulip and all of that. How did you deal with that, specifically with the Catholic view of the will, the Catholic view of good works, faith and righteousness and justification? Did you deal with that theologically?
Once I saw that the early church didn't believe those things, it didn't take much for me to be persuaded that my earlier views were wrong. And so looking again at the arguments, scriptural arguments for those things, they sort of fell apart. And it didn't take, I know there are other converts who really had to struggle with these issues and work through them in fine detail. For me, it was not like that. I read about the early church, and I look back at the Bible and the arguments for these doctrines, and I don't know why I was convinced of them at the beginning. And so...
one of the problems that I remember seeing with some of those things in my own journey was realizing that even Calvin's huge institutes is based on presumptions.
Yeah.
Little by little assumptions. So he has this great argument by the time he gets into the reasoning of things. But as you go way back, the assumptions he begins with are wrong. There's a whole group of evangelical Christians that went Eastern Orthodox, and when they describe why they did that, they say, we're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to look at all the issues from scratch, clean slate.
Yeah.
Of course, we can't accept the authority of the Pope, so he won't go there. So,
right.
So they begin their argument with a presupposition. They won't even examine papal fallibility. They presume it's wrong. Well, that was at the core of many of Calvinist arguments.
Yeah.
I mean, even his taking a spin on Augustine and making Augustine fit into his own philosophy.
Right.
What about your own struggle with philosophy then in moving to the Catholic Church?
Well, the areas of philosophy that I worked in did not really, they were sort of independent of these things. And at that time, I was doing most of my coursework anyway, so it was not, it didn't really influence my conversion, except maybe the attitude of philosophy and philosophers have towards truth. But after my conversion, well, I should explain something about what happened after my conversion, and it'll make more sense of my philosophy. So I converted. I was confirmed in 2008, and I kept calling my parents, right? And I would tell them all about what it is that I've discovered, these early church things, and they'd counter with biblical arguments, and I'd respond to the arguments. And this back and forth went on for, I would guess, maybe a year or so. And I should say that immediately before my parents' marriage, my mom had been confirmed in the Catholic faith. She had decided to become a Catholic. But the priest told her when she said, well, I don't believe any of that stuff about Mary, the priest had told her, well, we all have our issues with the Catholic faith. And she was never encouraged to make a first confession or anything like that. So her catechesis was nothing. But all that it would take for her to return is to make a first good confession. And so I was encouraging them, and my dad too, make a good confession. And so this back and forth went on for about a year. And my sister was very antagonistic towards the Catholic faith. In fact, I remember one time we were there for Christmas, and she was on the phone with my mom, and she said, did you go to Mass or did you go to real church? And I don't know how she responded, but at any rate, I started this dialogue on the side with my sister via email, again showing her the same sorts of arguments that I was presenting to my parents. And at a certain point, this sort of converged. I was talking to my mom one day about the Catholic faith, and she immediately broke down crying. And I was very out of character for her. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, I just remembered a dream that I had last night. I said, a dream? That's weird. And she said, my dad's mom and her were at a Mass. And they were watching, it was very stirring. They were watching the Mass, and then after the Mass, they left. And she said that she saw the priest who was celebrating Mass, and he was glowing and beautiful. And she just was, she couldn't speak to me anymore on the phone. She just, started crying in earnest and had to get off the phone. And that was like, I think it was a Friday. And that whole weekend I'm thinking to myself, stuff like that doesn't just happen. That's a saint that's in her dream. And what's going to happen is she's going to be somewhere doing something. She's going to see a picture and she's going to say, that's the glowing and beautiful priest from my dream. And so on Sunday, I'm talking to my parents again, and I tell my dad that, and I say, I bet that was a saint that appeared to her. And he said, well, do you have any ideas who might have it been? And I said, well, I don't know definitely, but there's this priest, Cardinal Newman, who was a famous convert from Protestantism to Catholicism. He would be a good fit for what's going on here. And so we talked, and I talked to my mom for a little bit, and then we got off the phone. And about 10 minutes later, I get this frantic phone call from my mom, and she says, Brian, this really goosebumpy thing happened to me. And I said, what? And she just repeated the same thing. And I said, well, what happened? And she said, have you ever heard of a person named Cardinal Newman? And I said, yeah. And she said, that was the one. That was the priest from my dream. And I said, wow, Mom, do you know what the significance of that? And I had to explain to her. She'd never heard of Cardinal Newman or anything about him. And so I explained the significance of that to her, and she was taken aback. Well, that's not the end of it. As I mentioned, I had been talking to my sister during that time about the Catholic faith, and it took a few days for my mom to feel confident enough to tell my sister about what happened to her. But a few days passed, and she was talking to my sister on the phone, and she described the dream and what had happened. And my sister responded, Mom, that dream was for me. I had prayed that very night, God, show me if Catholicism or Protestantism is true. But I don't want an angel appearing to me. That would freak me out. Send a dream. And she had prayed that the same night that my mom had gotten this dream with Cardinal Newman showing up. So it didn't take much for my mom, my sister, and my dad to enter the Catholic Church. My sister had to go through RCIA, but my parents just had to make good confessions for the time outside the church. So as far as my philosophy goes, I began to take this Cardinal Newman character seriously. I didn't know who he was in a very particular way, but I began to look more into what it was that he talked about. So since then, my doctoral work is really focused on making sense of the conscience in terms that in moral epistemology, which is the area of philosophy concerned with how we know about moral facts, trying to make sense of how the conscience fits into the picture that contemporary moral epistemologists paint. And so my dissertation work is a defense of what I call the prudent conscience view, which is this view that I've developed that tries to make sense of Cardinal Newman's and Thomas Aquinas's work on what conscience is.
Right.
And
I was going to say most Protestant philosophers are not big on the scholastics or Thomas Aquinas, and I wondered if you have seen that as it's a barrier to many Protestant thinkers.
Yeah.
Being closed to the working of Thomas Aquinas and the other scholastics.
Well, they all opened right up to me. The doctors of the church, for so long as a Protestant, it was all on my own, right? I had to, I could trust Wayne Grudem maybe. Van Til I could trust. But beyond that, I really had to scrutinize everything that I read. Well, there's these doctors of the church that I can read them, and I can be persuaded of what they say is true, and I can trust them. And so I began to read quite a bit. Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Thomas Aquinas, basically anything I can get my hands on that was in this Catholic tradition.
Well, in Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, all of those are really talking about a changed life, which would have been totally... In Calvinism, there wouldn't have been a need for growing in grace.
Right.
Growing in obedience, going through stages of spiritual development. I mean, so this was all new to you.
Yeah, and at the same time, that guilt that had been on my soul since college was just bearing on me. And so to realize that guilt was real guilt in the face of God, that I needed to make a confession and get that guilt off my soul, and then that there was this path of sanctity traced out by saints that are before me that entails actual and close union with God, rather than a sentimentalist union with God, or an ideological union that is explained as union, even though there's no real union of soul. So, yeah, these saints really move me.
A Calvinist might be listening and think you've gone from one extreme, where it's nothing that you can do, it's only God, to now it's all you. And we've got to make sure we correct that assumption, because that ain't the truth. That's what Catholics believe.
Oh, yeah, that's all on me. Well, it's certainly not all on me, because if it was, I'd be in a world of hurt. But the grace of Jesus, which is infused into my soul, makes me capable of doing these things. And it makes my trying to do these things meritorious, where before they wouldn't really have been meritorious in the eyes of God. So it is the grace of Jesus. But the notion of grace is the right one. And it's because it's the right one that I don't have to rationalize my guilt away anymore.
It's almost like that the really difference between Calvinism and the Catholic faith really is a philosophical issue, that it seems that most Calvinists get stuck on the either or.
Yeah.
And so you have the Arminians and the Calvinists battling over the either or, either this. It's either the free will of God, free will of man, or the sovereignty of God. Whereas Catholics, the mystery of the both and is the beauty of growing in sanctity.
That's right.
It really is totally grace. We know that, but we still have to give it our all.
That's right. Yeah. So I was very moved by seeing all these things, and the truth is important, not just because it's true, but because in this case it leads to happiness. So it really did change me, not just intellectually, but as a person more generally, to be confronted with these truths and to act on them. Very glad that I did.
Let's say that we have watching the program right now a person who is now where you were.
Yeah.
Calvinist, Presbyterian. Anything you'd like to say to them about why they should make the same journey home you've made?
Well, I mean, if they're moved by the early church, then I would recommend reading the early church fathers. That, in my mind, took away the barriers, which were rational arguments. I was able to see through the arguments based on looking at the way the early church really was, not the way that I had been sort of made to think it was. But it's funny because I know that there are a lot of people who read the early fathers. In fact, soon after I was converted, I started to talk to other graduate students. Like, you gotta read these chapters with me. So I remember having lunch with a very strong Protestant, and I had him read J.N.D. Kelly's chapter on Scripture and tradition, and he tried to gloss over the whole thing. One of the fathers thinks the bishops in unison are infallible, and complete gloss. Well, they're infallible when they read the Bible, this very glib perspective on what it is they say, not taking it seriously. And one of the things I asked him afterwards is, you think that you would, so you work with me as a graduate student. Are you telling me that someone 2,000 years later could read my dissertation and understand it better than you who's talking to me about it? And he said, yes, I think that. And he didn't really have much to say in response, and that was the last lunch. We'd agreed to, I'll give him something to read, and then he'll give me something to read. And he said, I'm too busy to meet with you again. So for those people out there, I recommend reading the early fathers, but also taking them seriously as having heard, the voice of Jesus and the people around him.
All right, Brian. Well, thank you for joining us on the journey home. Really appreciate it, and God's blessing on your continued work in your PhD studies. Thanks. Thank you for your witness, for you and Amy. Right. God bless you. And thank you for joining us on this edition of The Journey Home. I hope Brian's story is an encouragement to you to consider the beauty and fullness of the church. God bless you. See you next week.